Emily grew up in a small town where life was simple but full of hard work. The streets were dusty in the summer and muddy in the rainy season. Most families worked in farming, fishing, or small shops. Everyone knew each other and people talked a lot about who was doing what. In the middle of the town stood a small repair shop that smelled of grease, oil, and old engines. That shop belonged to Emily's father. He was known as a kind but hard-working man who could fix almost anything that had wheels or gears. From the time she was very young, Emily loved spending time in that shop. While other girls played with dolls or dressed up in fancy clothes, she liked holding screwdrivers and wrenches. She liked watching her father take apart a noisy engine and put it back together until it purred like a cat. To her, those sounds of tools clicking and machines starting were like music. She would often sit on a wooden stool watching her father's hands, try to copy what he did with smaller parts he gave her. But not everyone in the town liked the idea of a girl working with machines. Many thought it was strange. When Emily was a child, neighbors would smile kindly and say she'd grow out of it one day. But as she got older, the smiles turned into laughter or unkind comments. Boys from school, seeing her hands stained with oil, would mock her. They called her tiny hands and told her she should be helping in the kitchen, not in a shop full of grease. Even some grown-ups shook their heads and said, "That's not proper work for a young lady." Emily's hands were indeed small. She had been born that waist-slender fingers, delicate palms, and wrists so thin that people often joked she looked like she belonged to a doll, not a mechanic. Those words hurt her, but she never showed it. She would simply wipe the sweat from her forehead, smile, and continue working beside her father. Inside, however, she sometimes wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe her hands were too small. Maybe she would never be taken seriously. Her father, however, saw something different. He saw a girl with sharp eyes, steady patience, and a natural gift for machines. Many times when he struggled with a tricky problem, Emily would notice something small that he missed. She had a way of looking at things closely, noticing details others ignored. Her father often said, "Emily, you don't just fix machines, you listen to them. That's a rare gift." Those words stayed with her and gave her quiet strength. Still, the world outside the shop was not always kind. At school, Emily faced teasing. When she wrote essays about wanting to be a mechanic, her teachers would smile politely and suggest she'd think of something else, like teaching or nursing. When career fairs came to town, no one ever invited her to the stalls about engineering. She was always directed to crafts or cooking, but she refused to change her dream. Even when her classmates laughed, she raised her chin and said she wanted to work with engines. Deep down, she believed that one day she would get her chance. The town where Emily lived was close to a Navy base. Big gray ships often docked nearby, their tall masts visible from the harbor. Emily loved walking to the shore and watching the sailors move around the ships, fixing ropes, polishing surfaces, and loading supplies. Those ships looked like giants to her, powerful and untouchable. She dreamed of stepping onto one, not as a passenger, but as a worker who could help keep those engines alive. The thought of touching a Navy engine, something much bigger and more complicated than a car, filled her with excitement. But she also knew it was only a dream. After all, if people laughed at her for fixing cars, how would they ever allow her near something as important as a Navy ship? One evening, after the shop had closed, Emily sat with her father on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She asked him quietly, "Do you think people will ever stop laughing at me?" Her father looked at her, his face tired from a day's work, but his eyes kind. "Emily," he said, "people laugh when they don't understand. They see small hands and think small strength. But strength is not always in muscles. Sometimes it's in the heart, sometimes it's in the mind. One day those same hands they laugh at will do something none of them can, and then they'll see." Emily held on to those words. They became her secret fuel whenever doubt crept in. She worked harder than before, learning every detail of every machine in the shop. She spent nights reading manuals, sketching engine parts, and practicing with tools. Her hands may have been small, but they were quick, precise, and steady. She began to notice that there were places inside engines where her small hands could reach easily, where bigger hands struggled. She thought to herself that maybe her weakness could one day be her advantage. The people around her, however, did not change quickly. They continued to mock. When a car owner came into the shop and saw Emily working, some would whisper, "Is she really going to fix this?" Others would laugh and ask her father to handle it instead. But Emily kept going, never letting their words stop her. Each time she tightened a bolt or fixed a leak, she proved herself. Even if no one was ready to admit it, then something happened that would change everything. At the Navy base nearby, one of the ships developed a serious engine problem. It was not just any ship, but one scheduled for an important mission. The sailors tried their best, and the Navy mechanics worked for days, but the problem was hidden deep inside a narrow part of the engine. No matter what they tried, they could not reach the broken piece. The whole town heard about it, and people shook their heads, saying, "If the Navy experts can't fix it, then it can't be fixed." Emily listened quietly as the talk spread. Inside, she felt a strange pull. She did not know why, but she kept thinking about the problem. She imagined the tight spaces inside the engine and wondered if maybe, just maybe, her small hands could fit where others could not. But the thought of suggesting it scared her. After all, she was only the girl mechanic everyone mocked. Who would take her seriously against the Navy's experts? That night, Emily could not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing her father's words in her head. One day, those same hands will do something none of them can. She whispered to herself, "What if that day is now?" The story of the girl mechanic with tiny hands was about to take a turn no one in the town expected. The Navy base near Emily's town was usually a place of order and discipline. Ships came and went on their missions, sailors marched in rows, and the engineers worked quietly on their machines. But one morning, the air around the base was heavy with tension. A large Navy ship had broken down, and it was not just a small problem. The ship's engine, the very heart that kept it alive, had stopped working. Without it, the ship was useless, stuck at the dock like a bird with broken wings. The problem was simple to describe, but almost impossible to fix. A small but critical part inside the engine had failed. It was buried deep in a narrow compartment where tools could not easily reach. The piece had jammed itself in such a way that nothing could move. The engineers tried everything they knew. They brought out their best equipment, worked day and night, but the broken part would not budge. Every hour that passed added more pressure. This ship was not just any ship. It had been scheduled for an important mission that could not be delayed. Supplies had already been loaded, and sailors were ready. If the ship could not move, the mission would fail, and the blame would fall on the Navy's shoulders. Inside the base, senior engineers gathered in the control room. They spread out diagrams of the engine on tables, pointing to the tight spaces that made the repair so difficult. One officer sighed heavily and said, "We can see the part. We know what's wrong, but it's like trying to fix something locked inside a box without opening it." Another added, "Even our smallest tools can't reach in properly. And if we try to cut through, we'll damage the surrounding system. That would be even worse." The frustration grew. Sailors carried the news outside the base, and soon the whole town was buzzing with gossip. In the small cafe near the harbor, fishermen shook their heads. "If Navy experts can't do it, nobody can," one said. At the market, women whispered while buying vegetables. Imagine a giant ship stuck because of a tiny piece of metal. People laughed, but it was not a happy laugh. It was nervous because everyone respected the Navy and its power. The idea that even they could fail was unsettling. Emily heard these whispers too. As she worked in her father's shop, sailors came in to repair their small vehicles, and she caught pieces of their conversations. One sailor, frustrated, said, "We've been at it for 3 days. Nothing works. The ship is useless if this goes on." Another replied, "The commanders are losing patience. If it's not fixed soon, they'll have to cancel the mission." Emily pretended to focus on tightening a screw, but her ears caught every word. Her heart raced with curiosity. She imagined the narrow compartment inside the ship's engine. She pictured the stuck piece of metal deep inside, where big hands and heavy tools couldn't reach. She thought about her own small hands, the very hands people mocked. Could they slip inside that tight space? Could they do what others couldn't? But as quickly as the thought came, she shook her head. It sounded foolish. What would the Navy think if she walked in and offered help? They would laugh. They might even scold her for wasting their time. She was only the daughter of a town mechanic. No training, no uniform, no authority, yet the thought refused to leave her mind. That night, as she closed her eyes in bed, she could almost hear the ship calling to her. It was like a voice saying, "Try, just try." She tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Her father noticed her restless mood at breakfast the next day. "What's troubling you, Emily?" he asked gently, sipping his tea. She hesitated before speaking. "It's the ship," she whispered. "I keep thinking about the problem. I keep thinking, maybe I could reach where they can't. My hands are small enough." Her father looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, though his eyes were serious. "Emily, people may laugh, but remember, sometimes the one everyone doubts holds the answer. If you believe you can help, don't let fear stop you." Those words gave her a flicker of courage, though her heart still beat nervously. That afternoon, she found herself walking toward the Navy base. The guards at the gate looked surprised to see her. "What are you doing here, young lady?" one asked. She swallowed her fear and said, "I want to help. I think I might have a way to fix the engine." The guard frowned, ready to send her away, but another sailor nearby overheard and chuckled. "Her? Fix the engine. She has hands like a doll. Go home, girl." Emily felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She turned to leave, but then she heard another voice. "Wait," said an older officer who had been listening. He looked tired, his uniform wrinkled from sleepless nights. "We've tried everything and nothing has worked. Let her at least see the problem. What do we have to lose?" The younger sailors laughed, whispering to each other, but they followed orders. Emily was allowed inside. She stepped into the massive engine room for the first time, her eyes wide with awe. The engine stood before her like a giant beast, huge pipes, thick wires, and endless steel. The air smelled of oil and heat. Dozens of mechanics stood around, their faces frustrated. One of them pointed at the narrow gap where the broken part was jammed. "See that? It's stuck in there. We've tried wrenches, hooks, even long pliers. Nothing works." Emily stepped closer, peering into the gap. Her small hands twitched, as if they already knew what to do. She didn't say much, but inside her mind was racing. She could see why others had failed. The space was too tight for their tools, too small for their big fingers. But for her, it looked just possible. The sailors watched her with amused expressions. "What can she do that we can't?" one muttered, but Emily didn't let their words sink in. She remembered her father's advice and kept her focus. This was not about proving herself to them. It was about listening to the machine and giving her best effort. For the first time, she felt the weight of both fear and hope pressing on her shoulders. She was standing in front of a Navy engine, a place she had only dreamed about. And now, against all odds, she had been given a chance. She reached for the small wrench she always carried in her pocket. Her heart thudded as she thought, maybe this is the moment Father told me about. Maybe this is the day my small hands will show their true worth. The room grew quiet as Emily knelt beside the engine. The sailors stopped whispering and leaned in to watch. No one truly believed she could succeed, but curiosity held them. She placed her small fingers near the opening and took a deep breath. The battle between doubt and courage had begun. And everyone in that room would soon witness something they would never forget. Emily's heart raced as she knelt beside the Navy engine. The machine towered over her like a steel giant, its pipes and bolts gleaming under the dim light of the engine room. Sailors and mechanics stood in a half circle, arms folded, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and doubt. They whispered among themselves, some smirking, others shaking their heads. To them, the idea that a young woman with small hands could solve a problem that had defeated trained Navy experts sounded more like a joke than a real chance. One sailor leaned toward another and muttered, "She won't last 5 minutes. Just wait and see." Another added, "This is wasting time. She should go back to her toy shop." Their words floated in the air, sharp and dismissive. Emily heard them, but she didn't let them reach her heart. She remembered her father's steady voice, reminding her that courage was often quiet. and sometimes the hands people mocked could do what no one else dared to try. An older officer, the same one who had spoken for her at the gate, stood nearby with his arms behind his back. His eyes were tired but watchful. He wasn't smiling, but neither was he laughing. Something about him gave Emily a small sense of comfort. He had not promised her success, but he had given her a chance, and that was enough. She took a small wrench from her pocket, her favorite one that had been with her since her first repair in her father's shop. It was polished from use, the handle smooth from her grip. Holding it in her hand steadied her nerves. Slowly, she leaned closer to the narrow gap inside the engine where the broken part was jammed. The space was so tight that even light seemed to struggle to reach inside. Emily bent forward, tilting her head, and carefully slid her fingers in. The metal felt warm, almost alive, from the hours of failed attempts. She could feel the stubborn piece wedged in place like a stone in a crack. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, imagining the layout of the engine she had studied in her mind. She pictured the gears, the bolts, the small hidden corners that others had overlooked. When she opened her eyes, her breathing had steadied. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "You can do this. Just focus." The sailors leaned closer, watching her every move. One of them snickered, but the officer silenced him with a glare. The room grew quiet, the only sounds being the hum of machines in standby and the faint clink of her wrench. As she adjusted her grip, Emily's small fingers slipped into the narrow gap where larger hands had failed. She could feel the edges of the broken part, sharp and stubborn. She carefully guided the wrench into position. It wasn't easy. Every inch mattered. She had to angle her wrist in ways that made her arm ache, but she didn't stop. Her patience, built from years of working in her father's shop, became her greatest tool. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Sweat formed on her forehead, dripping slowly down her temple. Her hands, though small, remained steady. She adjusted, tested, and retested the angle. At one point, the wrench slipped and made a sharp clank against the steel. A few sailors chuckled, whispering, "Told you so." But Emily ignored them. She tightened her lips and focused even harder. She thought of the many times she had been teased in school, called tiny hands, and how those same hands had learned to fix what bigger ones could not. Each memory gave her strength. She thought of her father, sitting back in the shop, believing in her, even when no one else did. That belief gave her courage to keep trying. Finally, after what seemed like endless adjustments, she felt the wrench catch onto the stubborn part. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, carefully, she applied pressure. The metal resisted, groaning as if mocking her effort. Her arm trembled, but she didn't let go. She whispered again, "Move. Just move." The sailors leaned in, their whispers now silenced by the intensity of the moment. All eyes were on her small hand, gripping the wrench in the narrow gap. Then, with a sharp click, the jammed piece shifted slightly. Emily's heart leaped. She had done something no one else had managed. She steadied herself, tightened her grip, and turned the wrench again. This time, the part gave way with a scraping sound, sliding back into place. The sound echoed in the engine room like a victory bell. Emily pulled her hand out, holding the wrench, her fingers slightly red from the effort. She looked up, her face flushed but glowing with relief. For a moment, the room was silent, stunned. Then a low murmur rippled through the sailors. "She moved it," one whispered. "No way." Another said, "She actually did it." The officer's stern face softened, and for the first time, a small smile appeared at the corner of his lips. "Start the system," he ordered. The mechanics rushed to obey. They reconnected wires, adjusted the settings, and prepared the engine. Emily stood back, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. Her heart pounded in her chest as the large engine roared to life, louder and stronger than before. The ship vibrated, the sound filling the room with power and energy. Sailors who had laughed before now stared in disbelief. The machine that had mocked them for days was alive again. It was because of the girl with the small hands they had ridiculed. Some looked embarrassed, others amazed, but none dared laugh anymore. Emily stood quietly, her wrench still in her hand. She didn't cheer. She didn't shout. She just watched the engine hum steadily, knowing she had done what she came to do. Deep inside, she felt a swell of pride but also humility. She hadn't done this to prove anyone wrong. She had done it because she loved machines, and because she believed that even small hands could make a big difference. The officer walked over to her, his heavy boots echoing on the metal floor. He stopped in front of her and looked down with serious eyes. For a moment, Emily feared he might still dismiss her, but then he nodded slowly and said, "Well done. You've done something none of us could. You've given this ship its heart back." Emily felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she simply nodded in return. She knew this moment would stay with her forever. She had stepped into a place where she was not welcome, faced doubt from every corner, and still managed to succeed. As she left the engine room, the sailors watched her with new eyes. Some whispered softly, not with laughter, but with respect. Others simply remained quiet, humbled by what they had seen. For Emily, it was not about the crowd's reaction. It was about proving to herself that her hands tiny mocked and underestimated were capable of great things. The girl mechanic had taken her first step into a world that once shut her out. And though she didn't yet know it, this moment was only the beginning of how her story would inspire many others. The engine room buzzed with excitement after the great sound of the machine roared back to life. What had seemed impossible only hours ago now stood before everyone, running smoothly. The sailors looked at one another in disbelief, their eyes wide and their mouths slightly open. The same men who had mocked Emily's presence now stood frozen, their pride shaken. They had watched her small hands do what their strong arms and advanced. Tools could not. Emily herself could hardly believe it. She stared at the spinning gears, the humming pipes, and the steady thrum of the engine. Her chest rose and fell quickly as her heart tried to calm itself. She tightened her grip around the little wrench still in her hand. It was the same tool she had always carried, but today it felt like a metal. She had listened to the engine, been patient, and trusted herself. And now the ship was alive again. The officer who had given her the chance walked forward, his boots making a heavy sound on the steel floor. He stopped near her and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Young lady, you just saved us from failure." His words were simple, but the respect in his tone made Emily's eyes sting with tears. She quickly blinked them away. She didn't want anyone to think she was weak. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. The sailors around them remained quiet. A few nodded reluctantly, while others lowered their eyes, ashamed of how they had laughed at her earlier. But no one dared to speak against her now. They all knew the truth. Without her, the ship would still be useless. Without her, the mission would have been lost. The officer turned to the mechanics. "Run full tests. Make sure everything is stable," he ordered. The men hurried to follow his command. As they worked, Emily stood off to the side, watching with quiet pride. Every time the engine made a clean, strong sound, her heart swelled. She felt like she was part of something much bigger than herself. Hours passed as the Navy mechanics checked the systems. Finally, the officer announced that the ship was ready. The mission would continue. Sailors clapped each other on the shoulders, relief washing over them. They had been saved from disgrace, and they knew it was because of the girl they had once mocked. Emily was about to leave when one of the younger sailors, who had laughed the loudest earlier, walked up to her. He looked uneasy, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I was wrong," he said awkwardly. "You did what none of us could. I shouldn't have laughed." Emily gave him a small smile. "It's all right," she replied. "Engines don't care who fixes them. They just need someone who will listen." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. The sailor nodded and walked away, his cheeks red dot, when Emily stepped out of the engine room. The evening sun was setting over the harbor. The giant ship stood tall and proud again, no longer a broken bird but a powerful vessel ready to fly. The water reflected the golden light, and Emily paused for a moment to take it all in. For years, she had watched these ships from a distance, dreaming of being useful to them. Now she had actually touched one, repaired its heart, and left her mark on it. News of her success spread quickly, both inside the base and in the town. By nightfall, people were already talking. At the cafe, Fishermen who had once laughed about the ship's failure now told the story of how a mechanic's daughter had solved the problem. At the market, women whispered in amazement, "Did you hear? The girl with the small hands fixed the Navy's engine." Even those who had doubted her shook their heads in wonder. Back at her father's shop, Emily returned quietly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Her father, however, knew at once that something had changed. The glow in her eyes, the confident way she carried herself, told him the story before she even spoke. When she finally explained what had happened, he sat back in his chair, a proud smile spreading across his face. "I told you," he said softly. "One day, those hands would do something no one else could." Emily felt tears rise again, but this time, she let them fall. She hugged her father tightly, feeling the warmth of his belief wrap around her. She knew she had not only proved herself to the Navy, but also to everyone who had ever doubted her. The next morning, Emily woke to the sound of footsteps outside the shop. When she stepped out, she saw 2 Navy officers waiting for her. They greeted her formally, their uniforms pressed and their faces serious. One of them handed her a small envelope. "This is from the commander," he explained. "A letter of thanks for your service. The ship could not have sailed without you." Emily opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter written with respectful words, praising her courage, patience, and skill. At the bottom was the commander's signature. Reading it made her heart swell with both pride and humility. She folded the letter gently and tucked it away. Knowing it was something she would keep forever, though the letter was special, Emily did not let it change who she was. She still spent her days working in the shop, fixing cars and tractors alongside her father. But now, whenever sailors passed by, they no longer laughed. Instead, they greeted her politely, some even saluting her playfully with a smile. The mockery that had once followed her tiny hands had turned into respect. In the evenings, when Emily walked to the harbor, the ships looked different to her. They were no longer distant giants. She knew now that even a girl with small hands could play a part in their strength. She felt connected to them, as if one of their engines carried a piece of her spirit inside, but deep in her heart. Emily also knew this was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning. She had shown the world that her size did not define her ability. She had turned doubt into strength and laughter into silence. Now, she dreamed bigger dreams. Perhaps one day, she could work full-time on ships, traveling with them, caring for their engines as if they were living beings. The memory of that day in the engine room stayed with her. She remembered the heat of the machine, the sting of sweat in her eyes, the sharp click of the stuck part finally moving. She remembered the silence that followed, and then the roar of the engine as it came back to life. It was a memory she replayed often, reminding herself that no dream was too big and no hands were too small. If they carried determination and heart, and while many in the town still talked about her as the girl who fixed the Navy ship, Emily did not let the title go to her head. To her, she was simply a mechanic. Someone who loved machines, someone who listened carefully, someone who never gave up even when others doubted. The Navy ship soon left the harbor, strong and steady on its mission. As it sailed away, Emily stood on the shore, her hands tucked in her pockets, watching the vessel disappear into the horizon. She felt a quiet pride, knowing that part of its journey carried her touch. The girl with tiny hands, once mocked and doubted, had proven her worth not with loud words, but with patient action. And though the world still had many challenges ahead for her, Emily was ready. For she now believed with all her heart that courage, skill, and determination could make even the smallest hands mighty. Days turned into weeks after Emily had fixed the Navy ship. But the memory of that moment never left her mind or the minds of the people around her. The town was small, and news traveled fast, but this news did not fade quickly like most stories. People kept repeating it, each adding their own amazement. In the cafe, fishermen still told newcomers, "You see that little shop down the road? The girl from there saved a Navy ship." At the marketplace, mothers spoke about her as they bought vegetables, saying, "Her hands may be tiny, but her courage is big." Emily, however, continued her life as usual, She worked in her father's shop, fixing cars, bicycles, and farm tools. She still wiped grease from her forehead and carried her favorite wrench in her pocket. Yet there was something new inside her, an unshakable confidence. She no longer felt small in a world that had mocked her. She had proved not just to others, but to herself, that her gift mattered. One afternoon, as Emily tightened a loose bolt on a tractor, a group of schoolchildren passed by the shop. They paused to watch her, their eyes wide. A little girl whispered, "That's the girl who fixed the Navy's engine." Emily heard her words and smiled warmly. She waved to the children, who giggled and waved back before running off. For Emily, that moment meant more than applause. It meant that maybe, just maybe, some young girl who once thought dreams were too big for her small hands might now believe otherwise. Her father noticed the changes too. He often watched Emily as she worked, his chest swelling with pride. One evening, as they closed the shop, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know, Emily," he said gently, "when I first saw you hold a wrench as a child, I knew you were different. People laughed, but I knew someday your small hands would make a big mark. Now the whole town knows it too." Emily hugged her father, grateful for his constant belief in her. Without his encouragement, she might never have dared to step into the Navy base. Without his steady voice telling her that strength was not only in size, she might have let the world's laughter break her spirit. A few days later, Emily was surprised to receive another visitor from the Navy. This time it was not just a simple officer, but a senior commander. He arrived at the shop in a neat uniform, his medals shining on his chest. Emily and her father came out to greet him. The commander looked at Emily with a serious but kind expression. "Young lady," he said, "the Navy owes you a debt of gratitude. That ship you fixed went on to complete its mission successfully. Without you, it would have been delayed, perhaps even canceled. Your patience and skills saved not only a vessel, but also the pride of many sailors." Emily felt her cheeks warm. "I only did what I could," she replied softly. The commander smiled. "And sometimes what one person can do makes all the difference." He handed her a small Navy emblem pinned on a ribbon. "This is not an official medal, but it is a token of our respect. Keep it as a reminder of what you accomplished." Emily accepted the emblem with trembling hands. She looked at it for a long time, the symbol of the Navy gleaming under the light. To her, it was more than a gift. It was proof that even someone ordinary could leave an extraordinary mark. From that day on, Emily noticed that people treated her differently. When she walked through town, neighbors no longer whispered mockery. Instead, they greeted her with nods of respect. Some even brought their broken machines to her directly, saying, "If you could fix a Navy ship, you can surely fix this." Each time, Emily smiled and worked with the same care she had always shown, proving that her gift was not just for one grand moment, but for every task, big or small. Yet Emily did not let the respect change her heart. She remained humble. She did not boast about her achievement. She did not remind others of what she had done. Instead, she let the work speak for itself. Every engine she repaired, every machine she brought back to life, became a quiet echo of the lesson she had learned, that skill and determination were not measured by size. Months later, when the Navy ship returned from its mission, it docked at the harbor once again. This time, it was stronger and prouder than before. Emily stood at the shore, watching as sailors disembarked. Some of them recognized her and waved. One even shouted, "There she is, the girl mechanic." Emily blushed, but waved back. Deep inside, she felt connected to the ship. It was as if a part of her hands, her heart, and her spirit still lived inside its engine. That night, as she walked home along the quiet road, Emily thought about her journey. She remembered the times when children at school laughed at her, when neighbors shook their heads, when even teachers doubted her dreams. She remembered the sting of being called tiny hands as if it were an insult. And then she remembered the click of the wrench, the roar of the engine, the stunned silence of the sailors. Those memories together formed a story of struggle, patience, and triumph. Emily knew that life would still bring challenges. People might still doubt her in other places. But now she carried a truth that could never be taken away. She had faced laughter and turned it into respect. She had faced doubt and turned it into proof. She had faced fear and turned it into courage. Back at the shop, she placed the Navy emblem and the commander's letter of thanks in a small wooden box. She kept the box on a shelf above her workbench, where she could see it each day. It reminded her that even the smallest hands could hold great power when guided by patience, love, and determination. Years later, when people spoke about Emily, they didn't just call her the girl with tiny hands anymore. They called her the mechanic who saved a Navy ship. They told her story as an example of how no gift is too small and no dream is too big. Children grew up hearing about her, and some young girls found courage in her story to chase their own dreams, no matter how impossible they seemed. Emily herself never sought fame. She was content in her little shop, working beside her father, listening to the music of tools and engines. For her, that was happiness enough. But whenever she heard the distant horn of a ship sailing out of the harbor, she smiled quietly, remembering the day her small hands gave life to a giant, and in that smile lived a truth greater than any medal. That courage, patience, and belief can turn weakness into strength and doubt into victory. Emily had been mocked, doubted, and dismissed. Yet she had risen above it all, not with anger, but with quiet action. She had shown the world that hands, no matter how small, can carry the weight of great achievements. The girl mechanic with tiny hands had become a legend in her own right, not because she shouted her worth, but because she proved it when it mattered most.